Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Charcha 2020. This is the last of the justice tracks, last of the justice track. It's been a rollicking last few days that's been uplifting, grounding. It's just and inspiring in so many parts. This conversation that we have today actually happened last evening, but there was a conflict, so we had to record it, and now we're rebroadcasting it. The good part is that two of the panelists have agreed to be present here and take your questions if you have questions at the end of this discussion. This discussion actually is, as I mentioned during the conversation yesterday, it is a really critical discussion. All sectors have this moment when they have to, especially in today's age, they have to grapple with the question, how is data going to transform our sector? And then usually in the case of most sectors, the answer is profoundly. And that is also what it looks like for law and justice. Data could be absolutely transformative. It could change how we access information. It could change how transparent the system is. So I welcome you to this conversation, and myself, I was the moderator yesterday, and the panelist, and Kaustav Devbiswas, who's one of the panelists, he will join us so that we can do a Q&A towards the end. Meanwhile, just one last mention to you all. Please do, if you want to continue following a lot of these justice track-based discussions, do follow @Agami on Twitter and on Instagram, so that you are in touch with what's happening, to keep these conversations alive and make sure these are not just academic discussions. Let's continue with the conversation. Yeah.
We'll bring to the table. We have Professor Girishnath Jha, who's actually developed, who's a professor who's actually developed a corpora or training data or clean data around Indian languages. And not just, when I was doing my research, 17 different languages. They actually built tagged corpora for 17 different languages. That experience is incredible and worth tapping into to see what does it mean, what can we learn from that process. We have Kaustav Devbiswas. Kaustav, what has been absolutely fascinating about your own journey is you've really seen the arc of AI and ML in different areas. You've been an entrepreneur yourself, you're a technologist, and now you've been working as a fellow at CPR, working on the Land Rights Initiative. You've actually been working on property-related legal data. So, what have you seen? And your perspective is absolutely critical. Shilpa Kumar, what's super valuable is, before being an investment partner at Omidyar, you were MD and CEO of ICICI Securities, and you come from that financial sector, which has been absolutely transformed by data. And bringing in that perspective and seeing not just from that perspective, but also what are you seeing as critical strategic investments that are being made in this space. So we have a group that can really open up this conversation, make it pop, and look at dimensions of it that will be important for us. And this is not a conversation that we want to have just for the sake of having a conversation. This is a conversation we want to have because we feel that this is an important area where work needs to be done, and that work has to be collaborative work. So treat this as an invitation to move forward and do collaborative work. So to get started today, I want to, just share a little story. And this is a story that is probably familiar in the it's a legend almost in the technology circles, but it's the story of this lady called Fei-Fei Li. And Fei-Fei Li, about 12 years back, she was at Stanford, and she saw a situation. She saw that the way technology was evolving, especially in artificial intelligence, they had a very specific problem. Computers, in order to become really intelligent, needed to understand language, needed to understand images, and be able to say, what is it? What are they seeing? Otherwise, there's a limit to how much intelligence really you can, give a computer. And at that point in time, the way of training computers to to understand what they were seeing on the screen was actually to model out like, oh, this is a cat. So it's got a circle on its head and it's got a triangle. It's got two little triangles on the side. And here's what a cat looks like. But anyone who has a cat, cats don't look like that all the time. Cats can be under something, curled up. So the crazy thing was that this sort of model that we're going to teach, you're going to create well-structured models and tell computers, this is what it looks like. That wasn't really working. And Fai Li had a pivotal insight that we need to train we need to trust the way computer intelligence is evolving and train computers like children. We need to expose them to huge amounts of pictures and get them to figure out that this is the pattern of a cat. It's not about a circle on the head. It's not, hey, this is the pattern. It could look like this, it could look like that. But if you train the computer with enough images of a cat in various situations, cat under the table, cat on top of a tree, cat eating something, ultimately the computer will figure out what a cat looks like in any situation. And the only challenge that she encountered was, how much data do you need to train the computer to do that? And Fai Li created what became a pivotal project called Image, and it was a collaboration of Stanford and Princeton. And they ultimately generated 1 billion candidate images and finally 14 million clean images, which were used and today have become like a foundation of image recognition in the world of machine learning and AI. And another data point that drove me crazy was 50,000 people worked on this project, and a lot of them in India using Amazon Mechanical Turk. So people did their bits to say, here's an image, this is what it's saying. Here's an image, this is. So it became this massively spread out project where everybody contributed to create, to say, here is an image I found on the internet of a cat doing this. And here is an image. And somebody was cleaning up that. So it was this incredibly massive collaborative project that resulted in a huge boom. And I find that deeply inspiring, that combination of human ingenuity, that data, that labeled data that could be used to train computers, and of course the computer algorithms that were anyway strong, that combination resulted in a burst of intelligence, particularly accelerate access to justice in our country in the next 2, 5, 10 years. That's the big question in front of us. So with that massive challenge and with that big goal in front of us, let me begin by asking Shilpa a question. Shilpa, what are the possibilities? And when you answer this question, feel free to also reflect on any other sector you've seen transform. What are the possibilities, Shilpa? Are we getting Shilpa? Yeah, Shilpa, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me, Sachin. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, so I actually want to say, if you consider two of the sectors Hello.
Yeah, Shilpa, we're with you. Go for it. Yeah.
Sachin, yeah. So I say I've lived through two sectors which have seen a dramatic change in terms of what was happening in the sector because of technology and data. One is the banking sector, the other is security. Secondly is the consumer benefited in very, very significant ways. I mean, if you consider securities market around the time I started working, which tells you my age, at that time, it was really open out. We did not have a tech platform which enabled trading. And there was a lot of fear that what will happen when the securities market goes, digital. The great news is not only did the consumer benefit in terms of lower costs, greater access to liquidity, but the resultant increase in the whole mutual fund industry, the whole shift, I would say a whole new community got created. Fund managers, financial advisors, fintech platforms, knowledge platforms. And therefore, what you really saw was the consumer benefited, the community benefited. Flip side of that is corporate India could access funds cheaper because there was more money flowing in. And therefore, really technology and data can be extremely transformative. And one of the reasons Omidyar really believes in this is we think any problem, if you put entrepreneurs, if you put technology, you might have some good outcomes in terms of options for going forward. Really, our belief is if the goal is access, surely technology and data could be a good starting point together.
Thank you, Shilpa. That's super. So I think, in what you said, and there were little bits that we lost some of the connection, but I think it came to us. I think we got the gist of it. But I think in what you said, what I find most insightful is the unexpected outcomes, which are now today kind of expected in the sense, but like the fact that really it ends up building ecosystems. When you see new possibilities, especially when you bring data into a system, you see new possibilities that you may not have conceived of earlier. So one thing which, for instance, is happening in the legal sector, which I find interesting, is people are saying, this is why we need the data. But the crazy thing that you're pointing out is the way it works is both ways, right? You might say, this is why we need the data, but when the data comes, there's 1,000 other possibilities that emerge. And that, I think, is really exciting. And a theme we should remember, that what we may not completely know what comes out of it, but by itself, it's incredibly valuable. Thanks, Shilpa. I want to bring a question here on just reality check on where we are. So where are we? I believe in 2018, there was a huge leap where Google essentially published some technology, BERT, as it's called, which had a huge, tremendously, it moved the envelope on computers understanding text. And apparently that was quite pivotal. And I am no technologist, but in my reading, it seems to have been a big shift. But Vivek, let me ask you, what were the implications of this evolution or leap in computers understanding free text?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Sachin. And I think that going back to the ImageNet example that you had talked about, ImageNet came out probably, and that was a data-driven thing. Then ImageNet itself came about maybe in 2008-9. And probably by 2012 was the first time that a deep learning system became better than the other systems. And about 2015 was the time when computers started seeing better than humans. Okay, so therefore, when you say given an image and a human has to classify it, 2015 is probably the year when we started seeing better than humans. And now it's not even close. Actually, it is actually computers can actually understand an image, especially given sufficient training, significantly better than a human can. And the same thing, at least, that is, what happened in 2015 in the case of image actually started happening in 2018 in the case of text and understanding of text. And there's many different ways by which you can understand how well a computer understands text. And, one of the benchmarks which is used is what is known as the Stanford question answer database, where you're given a paragraph, and those who've taken SAT or GRE or an exam, something like that, would know that you're given a paragraph, and then you're given a free text question, and you have to identify where in that paragraph the answer to that question lies. And so in 2018, for the first time, after this BERT, and this was basically. Was the first time that, and by the way, the reason that BERT came across, which is very interesting, is slightly different from the ImageNet thing, because in ImageNet, you had what is known as labeled data. And obviously labeled data is something that you need to do a lot of work to create labeled data. But what Google did, and Google, this is, even though it was done by Google, is an open source thing. But what Google did was basically, it tried to, so there's two things, that it tried to, it took basically all of Wikipedia or some very, very large corpus of text, and then basically hid certain words from the training, and then it tried to train to predict those words correctly. And so therefore, since it had the original text to begin with, you actually didn't need to actively label it. And therefore, you had a massive data set to actually train these things both backward and forward. And as a result of this, you actually created, for the first time, you could answer questions. An AI program was able to answer questions from a given text better than a human could do that from reading the same text. Now, of course, they changed the benchmark, and I think they should, because for many years, AI was not coming close to what humans could do, but suddenly they blew past it. And then they actually created a new benchmark, which is the right thing to do. In fact, the most interesting thing, the original version of the question answer benchmark was actually such that, if you, the original was that it would give you the best possible answer, and maybe sometimes the answer wasn't there in that text at all. And so the second version is they tried to create those kinds of data sets where you ask a question whose answer doesn't exist in the text, and still see whether the computer is it. And we've made now steady progress. Every few weeks, a few weeks and months, performance on these quad data sets. So that just unleashed a new kind of thing. And that, already the concept of transformers in areas of translation, etc., were actually still already becoming better. So and so therefore this quantum leap happened because of BERT, and BERT was created because you ran something around.
I did, and what was fascinating was that this leap of helping computers understand text in context. So that this, it's not just understanding words, it's also understanding the meaning of a sentence.
Yeah.
and place, and especially long sentences. And I think that suddenly, I'm sure if I was in the legal space or whatever, I'm suddenly thinking, oh my God, where is this going? So I think that's really fascinating that leap has happened. Let me take that thing on the leap. And I'll come, Vivek, you raised this question of the question and answer. And I learned something interesting about some of the early work on the legal data on questions and answers. I'll pick that up and come back later. But Costa, I want to come to you and ask you, so does this progress make it easier to read a paragraph of judicial reasoning or a judgment or a section of a law? Where does this place us?
Yeah, thanks for that. Good evening, everyone. As a background, first of all, I really share the excitement that Vivek brought to the table. It's an exciting time, and last few years I've seen a change in NLP. But legal text is a specialized form of natural language, so it's not exactly the way we...
It's definitely unnatural language.
It basically does not read, it doesn't read like the way we are used to in our everyday conversational exchanges or language on the web. And some of these neural models, which achieved amazing performance in language analysis, translation, and even language generation, these models are all trained over this general corpus, of natural language. And second, it's also trained on much shorter text forms, like comments, reviews, posts, and tweets. And this, because of this, some of these off-the-shelf pre-trained neural models do not yet perform as well as we would like them to. And especially, we benchmark them against like some of the more classical machine learning, like, I don't want to be too technical, but linear support vector machines, like some of them still actually do some of these classify legal documents better than neural language models. I would, just talk about like what we are doing at Land Rights Initiative at CPR. We are looking at Supreme Court judgments on land rights for the last from the 1950s, and what we saw was exactly so, that linear SVMs are like the traditional machine learning algorithms are actually performing slightly better. So I think, and also this is also echoed by other researchers in another part of the world, like Singapore Management University. They in 2019, last year, they posted some results, and they also found a similar kind of results when comparing and benchmarking different kind of classifiers. So I think it's both exciting, but also there's a lot of work to do to look at the neural models and their architecture and all the whole architecture, and see like how we can apply them on neural net on legal text in the same to get the same kind of successes. So yes, I share the excitement, but there are some caveats and some work.
So what I hear you saying at some level is that there are different approaches, of course, in the technology part of it, because it's not just that the only approach is the BERT approach. There are some other approaches, but importantly, is it correct to say that both these approaches require you to train the software with data? Like you require clean, structured data to train these solutions? Like, is the data that is available in the way, in the form that you want it to use this technology?
Yes, I think generally in machine learning, you need some training data. There are certain, it also depends on the problem you're trying to solve. Like, for example, Vivek, his work, it is not as dependent. Like, we used a lot of supervised machine learning in our work. So structured data and and often labeled data is very valuable. However, I think data access is still a big issue in India. In spite of the promise of the National Informatics Center with its Juris platform, I think there's no API access still. The bulk access to is restricted and behind captchas, etc. And a lot of these documents and court judgments, etc., may not be machine readable, even if you have the documents. So there is a little bit of machine learning just to parse and get the text. And most of what we do is still dependent on providers like Manupatra, and the documents are in the form of PDF and docx. So there's a little bit of work to get the data. And if you look at legal text broadly, I mean, you can, even if once you have the data, there are various kinds of inconsistencies across the structure and form, owing to the large number of courts and the large the source of the data is disparate and across our nation. We have regional languages, something again which Vivek is very close to, and so research units have to figure out homegrown ways to deal with a lot of this the cleanup exercises before they can actually start analyzing. So I think the opportunity and the grand task in our space lies somewhere here is bringing this giant corpus of legal data to a place where it's more readily machine readable and analyzable. I think it's probably the biggest threat to any progressive research moving forward and innovation in this ecosystem.
So what I hear you, and I'm going to come to Vivek just as a follow-up to this, I hear two things, right? One is the access to the raw data, just easy access to raw data. And the other is that even if you get this data, you have to do a lot of cleaning up and stuff so that you can then train the systems to make sense of the raw data, right? You need training data sets. So you need both the access to the raw data, but you also need to do effort to make sure that it's in a form so that you can actually use it with the technology that can understand data, right? So because just to make it clear to everybody here who's not from a completely technological domain, these new technologies that are there, in order to, just the way ImageNet required all those images, and I know this may not be a perfect analogy, but let me still use it, just the way ImageNet required these labeled images to help the computer understand the patterns, you will require clean legal data so that the computers so that the technology can actually understand the raw data and say, okay, this is a section of a law, this is a reasoning, this is, and some of it, of course, is beyond computers right now, but ultimately makes sense of a paragraph of reasoning and find the conclusion in a judgment. So just to make it clear for everybody, there are these two needs, the general data as well as the clean structured data, so you can actually train software to become its full potential. Picking up on that, and feel free to correct me at any point, but picking up on that, let me ask you this, Vivek, just as a follow-up, which is, in your experience, what is your feeling, right? How much data, like how big an effort is this to create the clean data that is required to train these NLP solutions so that they can start to generate value and outcomes in the legal and law and justice space?
Yeah. So firstly, I think this two things. Obviously, access to the raw data is something that is important, and clearly, there are the questions of API access and things like that. But I think our goal is to actually create tools that actually, once you get the data, then you are able to get it in a form that is usable by these NLP tools. And we are focused on translation, but most of the cleanup work that we are doing is actually not necessarily restricted to just machine translation kind of that is a translation kind of work. And I think the interesting thing is, and that's actually our goal, is to create these data sets and make it usable and make it available to people. That's part of the, and here talking, I'm part of what is known as Project Anuvad, where basically the goal is to develop translations in Indian languages. And actually the legal domain is one of the early domains that we have been working in. And I think more important in that in the data set is to actually take data from various sources. And so we are building pipelines that include OCRs in various, Indian languages. And then there are various kinds of, and how the data needs to be converted. And somebody has a PDF, somebody has a docx, something else. All of those data to actually take it and convert it into a form that is accessible to basically these tools. And then we want to create these corpuses. And I think that is really I think that the whole point is to create these corpuses that whoever wants to use it and can then make the best use of it. And in fact, it is our stated goal. And I think in legal data alone, I'm saying this year, we will create larger translation corpuses in Indian languages than occur in any other domain. I mean, I think that our goal, because we're not using completely manual techniques to do something like this. We are using lots of programmatic techniques, and our intent stated goal is to actually, in fact, today, the largest open, even take a language like Hindi, okay, the largest publicly available data set to actually aid translation between English and Hindi is something from IIT Bombay, which is actually probably have 1.5 million sentences which are parallel. And we think that we will be, many times more than that in legal data alone in Hindi this year. Okay, so and I think so, but because we see that creating the data is almost as important as the final output that we are generating and making it available to all kinds of people. So it's a non-trivial thing. It's a lot of dirty work. It's not, but unless you put in the hard yards. I mean, in pretty much, I have interest in languages in various things. And we have actually, despite, having some of the, many of the Indian languages are among the most spoken and most written languages in the world, the amount of data that is available for these classes of tools is in the public domain is very small. And then, therefore, then we are dependent on the Googles and the big players in the world, because they're the only ones who have that data. And so it's something that we've been working in the legal domain, and we have actually developed translations from between 9 Indian languages right now, 9 Indian languages, and in the legal domain, I think we think we are better than Google or something that you can actually see in that kind of thing. And we've actually built many utilities also, because we recognize that even in the area of translation, right, you don't get 100% correct translation in something like that. So even if you're like, but we've actually built a whole bunch of interactive tools which actually help you help you actually complete a task like that significantly faster than you could otherwise.
Vivek, that sounds like you've gone at a particularly hard problem at a time when one would think you should nibble at stuff. Like, it seems like a really hard problem. Like, translating legal language in other Indian languages means you have to first understand the legal language in English.
So let me comment on that point. It's actually interesting that while legal language is more complicated, it is actually ending up being a little bit more structured than general language. So actually, if you train with data that comes from legal language, it actually is, and I don't know, I wasn't prepared. Maybe I'll share our websites and people can actually go and try these things out. But the thing is that it's interesting that even though more complicated, translating them ends up becoming, it's quite possible to use these techniques to come up with good translations. Now, sometimes it does it wrong, so therefore you can't, believe it's not 100%. Amazing that how good it can become. So.
I see.
Yeah.
And Vivek, just to clarify something, so what I hear you saying is that what you're doing is you're at some level automating the process of even generating like you're putting out a repository of tools and the data, both.
Yes.
And ultimately you are confident that tools and data can then be built upon by other people in various directions.
Yes.
So at some level, you are developing a kind of commons, which is going to be instrumental for more types of meaning making from legal data.
Absolutely. And I think the tools, everything we do is open source. This is in Project Anuvad. It is completely open source and complete and available for anybody who wants to build on it. Because we realize that our languages are not something that, and legal, of course, is a specific domain that we've decided to kind of work on. Is something that we need to, working on. And because we are not, we are not a commercial entity. We want actually to actually have this kind of collaboration and innovation to take things forward.
So let me ask a quick follow-up there, Kaustav. I want to just also ask Jameson, who else is creating these kind of training data repositories or even tools to generate clean training data? Who else is building? Maybe Kaustav, I can ask you pieces for different sectors. Doesn't have to be legal. Or in law would be great, to know. I haven't come across that many.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, and thank you, Sachin, for having me on the call. It's been a pleasure just listening to all of the experts. So there are a couple examples of legal data sets. There are a number of researchers throughout the United States and in the UK, at least those that I'm familiar with, who've been working on this. The Free Law Project, going to create a repository, an open repository, a free repository of case law in the United States, and have been working for a number of years as a nonprofit on that project. There's the Case Law Access Project at Harvard. Harvard, working with a company called Ravel, which is now owned by LexisNexis, digitized the entire Harvard Law Library. And now they're going through the process of trying to make sense of it, to structure it, to build tools on top of it. So that's been making real progress over the past couple of years. And in fact, 2 or 3 years left in the contract before it's free. And so that's a really, really exciting thing. There are a number of other university centers. At Georgia State University, there's a legal analytics lab, and they've focused on pulling together data, whether it's legal financial data, regulatory data, court data, criminal law data. But most of this work has been for academic research projects, less on the pure NLP training for models. But there is a lot out there that's happening right now.
That is super insight. Kostav, anything you're familiar with?
In India, most of the work, I mean, is, there's a lot of quantitative analysis that is happening around law. A lot of independent researchers in universities or, in centers for legal policy, they're building up these, they're sharing results. And often, like, you can backtrack and try to create like training data for them. But I don't think the motivation of these researchers is to build training data.
Yeah.
It is more like, they have problems and questions, and they are trying to answer them using reports. And often the data backing those reports are out there and they're published and you can access them. But if you're thinking of case analysis and training machines for case analysis, you can use those data sets, but there's a little bit of work to do to kind of make them, take them.
Got it.
That far, yeah.
Got it. That's Vivek, anything you want to add in there?
No, I mean, I think what I'd like to say is that, yes, part of it is a little bit of you have to have a little bit of never say die approach. I mean, we have captchas, but we pretty much have downloaded every single judgment from the Supreme Court at these last 10 years.
There'll be many in this audience, Vivek, who will smile and share a coffee with you on that topic. But we will not go into it officially.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that obviously, you've got to do what you have to do, but I think that, I think that the data is there to be. The data is there if we work on it, but I think that these things need to become open, and those are not the reasons actually. In fact, not having that data, I mean, and frankly, I'm sure, going back many years may become a little bit harder, but at least, 15, 20 years in all courts, we should have all the data. And then so many different things can actually be done using that. And I think that there are other people who are actually doing similar things and actually doing different kinds of things, kind of a legal, question and answer things. I know companies which are actually working on those kinds of things, and obviously I don't know exactly how they do, but they do have access to this.
Circumstances, how can we accelerate this future? So if I was to bring that question to Kostav, you and Jameson and Vivek as well, like, how do we accelerate this future? If you had to, all of you committed from enough visibility into the entrepreneurial world and said, let's focus on this. I think, Vivek, you've touched on one part, the access to the raw data. If you can build on that, how do we access, this future? That would be great. Maybe Kostav, I'll start off with you and then move around.
Yeah, I mean, see, we are talking about trying to analyze like systems of justice in society. So it's a hard one to kind of point out that one thing that we will do will change the game, especially where we are at right now. I think we're at the very early stage. I mean, and it'll take an ecosystem of different kinds of innovation to come together, from data providers opening up to the research community asking the right questions, and technologists building these kind of engineering solutions. But where we're at right now, I think, some of this, other than like just sharing data, Vivek also pointed out, like, sharing tools and all the software that will help researchers quickly analyze. I think, I can see like sharing models, like once we have trained models, different researchers kind of put them in a commons, which you have brought up many times. I think right now that's where we're at. It's about building a large corpus of both data benchmarks, models, and yeah, I think that's where we are at right now.
Got it. Vivek?
In terms of acceleration, I think one of the things that we do see is the fact that I think one of the things that's very interesting, especially in this whole area of AI, is that most of the code in even the latest technologies, even something was 3 weeks ago, actually gets open sourced. And what doesn't get open sourced is actually the data. So actually so whatever we do, and any utility, anything you build, if there is that concept of sharing and you use it for different purposes, and I think that's the way that we can actually accelerate, that if everybody shares what they have. And I think that's now obviously sometimes if there are commercial interests, things actually may not go in that direction. But then some of the things that you have to understand is that how we move forward as a domain, okay, depends on how much we want to share. And I think that is the important thing, that people have to have a little bit of a long-term view. I mean, as I said, right, as a former entrepreneur, I don't actually have any thing against somebody who's doing something for profit, but actually see that if you actually work together and build things together. I mean, for example, and this is a general AI question, not really legal or NLP question. I see that a lot of people in AI seem to think that data is their kind of, is their sticky special sauce or their USP. And actually that's a very short-term view. I mean, if that's the case, then the only people who will win is Google and Facebook and others. And everybody else is actually building silos of little data sets, which may be good for something in particular. And then, if you look at it from a larger perspective, we all lose. So I think...
Vivek, one thought that comes to my mind, I want to ask Girish this question, which is, the sharing culture. As the small startup could very easily say that, why should we share? I mean, the only thing we have is these tools, these models. Like, there could be this mindset or this data that is hard won, because in India, there's not even an API. So how do you trigger sharing cultures? I'm curious in the linguistics domain. Girish, you've done painstaking work on the corpora for Indian languages. Like, did you encounter the situation of how do you really build a community of people who are willing to share, who are willing to collaborate, even if they had been working on it separately? Any insights there, Girish?
Yeah, thank you, Sachin, and good to connect with everybody. Data creation in India has been a huge issue. People are not aware that data is so important, and sharing data is more important than actually creating it. And we had an issue actually with group that we have to create data as per certain standard, and then be able to see each other's data and comment on it. And not only that, after we create the data has to be then put to use. And there is no mechanism. It was a Government of India funded project, and there is no mechanism of actually immediately putting data in the open source. So now actually we have built a mechanism where data is going to be put on our Government of India website. People can. But there has to be a much more concerted effort in getting every part of India and every community a sense of a common resource location where everybody can access it and then build on the data. That is what is needed in India, certainly.
But when you came across resistance to sharing, were there insights, was there experiences there, and how do you incentivize that sharing? That anything you can recount, Girish?
Well, there are people are scared because the data might be linked to some proprietary, innovation software. And I'm talking about, the companies first, and then academia also are worried that the data might be linked to their research, and they may not want to immediately release it. But after the publication is done and after the software has progressed to the next level, data can certainly be released in the public domain. But again, a lot of resources are normally pumped in to create data. And in case of industry and company, they would like to get that back. So what I'm saying, if you have some model of sharing like LDC of University of Pennsylvania or ELRA, the European Language Resource Association or Linguistic Data Consortium, I mean, these organizations work on membership, institutional membership, individual membership, and you give your data and you get data back. So this culture has to be actually created in India, and this is possible because when I had this 17 university consortia, and Jenny was the leader of that consortia, we realized that it is possible to do it actually.
I see. That's super. Jameson, I'm sure you're like, I know this place, I know the situation. Can you share your thoughts on your effort?
Sure, absolutely. So last year we did some research at Stanford. It was Codex, which is the Center for Legal Informatics, and then also a legal design lab run by a woman named Margaret Hagan. And the idea was, we knew there was a problem out there, which was that data was either proprietary, or if it was available, it was balkanized, it was unstructured. Many of the problems that have been raised on this call that applied to India also apply to the United States. And so we did some research on various sharing models that were out there and determined that a legal data commons was the best way to go. The barrier, I think, that was raised, that has been raised by Sachin's question, is one of community and bringing people together. And I think a core part of that is, what problem are you trying to solve? And who's your audience? Who is your community? And so if the problem is NLP for legal texts, maybe you need a research community based in universities or R&D labs at large legal informatic companies and publishers or within government. But if what you're really talking about is advancing access to justice, the community is much bigger. One of the things that we've been trying to do at Legal Hackers is to build an open grassroots community of people interested in innovation at the intersection of law and technology. And within that, one of the core issues that we've been focusing on is open legal data. So working together with Harvard, and ICL R&D, which is the R&D lab for the England and Wales Law Reporter, we started hosting open legal data forums. We did a global one for all of our organizers, and the idea was you could host each one of these within local communities throughout India, throughout the world, in order to sensitize people to this idea of sharing, the benefits of sharing. Law is a community that prides itself on confidentiality, on proprietary tools within the publishers. And I think that's really the core barrier, is a cultural one. It's one that resides within us. And it's something that only we as lawyers and researchers who've worked in the open can help to overcome. And so I think through workshops, bringing people together from the legal side, our specific vertical, our specific domain, and then the research side on the NLP, on whether it's NLP or legal informatics more broadly, coming together, sharing our common languages, sharing our common problems, and showing that we can work together and solve them really is the way that we can overcome this. And I think ultimately, I wish that I could take everything that Vivek said and put it on a t-shirt and wear it around the town hall because it was so brilliant and so on the mark, but it really starts with community and showing people the value. And so that's my answer, Sachin.
No, I think what you said about showing people the value is a really interesting thing, rather than lecturing or making a laden statement, like showing people kind of mutual respect models. If you share, and those kinds of things, which I think are really great. Let me, a quick question to the audience. I'm going to come to, whoever was talking, but quick, there's a poll going out there. Are you developing training data and tools? Please do yes or no. Please let us know. We'd like to get a flavor of what it's like. As the audience answers that question, I think somebody else wanted to chip in. Did somebody else want to, before I move to the next one, I kind of caught edge of something. Okay, nothing in particular. So this kind of project, if it has to be, this kind of culture, if it has to be built, of sharing these tools, sharing this data, are there other examples of it being done in other sectors, possibly in India? I don't know, Vivek, Costa, where you've seen it being done, like well structured, like the nudges are good, the incentives are good, and it's moved the needle, that we can draw inspiration from?
In the healthcare segment, for sure, I mean, we have a similar problems in the healthcare sector as well. There are reams of documents, and and it's often precision. The amount of precision that is required is much higher. But I think there has been, like, on the web, if you search, like, there'll be lots of models out there which you can kind of pick up.
A lot of individual action, a lot of self-organized groups kind of responses.
Yeah, and much like I wish there was something like, I mean, on GitHub itself, you would see like a lot of people like just sharing models all across. So it's hard to point out like one thing, but yeah. I think in other sectors like healthcare, like even finance, and there are tools which are and data which is shared. Yeah. So
awesome, Vivek.
So actually, it's interesting. Data sharing, it's not that common. And that's what one of the things is that it is not that common. But I think language, I mean, and legal is I take it as a subset of language, is actually one of the first areas where we can do this, is what I think. I think that we should be sharing in all areas as far as AI, and as Girish also think, we need to figure out the mechanisms and the models. They involve financial transactions, also models which could be used for
We can hear you, Vivek. Keep going. Vivek, you're muted. You'll have to unmute. Just unmute.
Oh.
Yeah. You were saying financial. Yeah, we'll have to think of financial models.
I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought that. We'll have to think of financial models for also. That's.
Thanks for calling that out.
Areas.
Thanks for calling that out.
I think financial models. So for various reasons, right? I mean, I think especially in this kind of an environment, actually doing some of these things to be more self-reliant, because one of the things is that AI requires two things: algorithms and data. And algorithms are all open, and data is what you need to actually get things done. So therefore, there is a certain reason to actually have that rallying cry. But on the other hand, you should also build financial models or other kinds of models that make it useful or make it easier for people to contribute data and work in a collaborative manner. So I think if some of those interesting things, if instead of just being purely something that is free, maybe there are kind of commercial models also that get involved in there too, which can help in creation of data, because in the end, a marketplace of some kind.
No, thank you for calling that out. I appreciate that. It should not, like, I can see a robust conversation on the chat where people are saying, it's not all love, fairy dust and happiness. There are issues that people might be faced with in terms of, so quickly queuing up the results from the poll about are people creating training data. Okay, wow, 37% of attendees are. No, that's really interesting. So I think that's a high proportion given the diversity of attendees. Let me just go to some of the questions, because I know that these questions are, Jameson, I still have one question I want to come back to you on, which is the question around sustenance of such a project, but I'll wait just to resolve some questions that are coming from the audience. So one thing that a question that has come up is, are there, maybe we can do one, is there a particular use case that you're most excited by that is, say, attainable in, say, 3 years? I'll go around the room. Maybe we can start off with, and let's just to broaden this out. I want, Girish, I would love to even hear you. We brought you in for the diversity of perspective. I'd love to even hear you in terms of a use case for the linguistics corpora, if you can point out your favorite use case. We'll start off with maybe Kaustav, and then Girish, I'll come to you and pick up a use case on the corpora as well. Kaustav, a single use case in, say, 3 years? You're muted. Kaustav, you'll have to unmute.
Sorry, totally skipped that. Yeah, I would like to see our justice system becoming more transparent, like having for example our criminal justice system, just looking at trends of litigation and it's about transparency. And if in 3 years' time we have places where average citizen can check what's going on. And I think that'll be...
That's going to be really popular with some of the judges. I can see that's really popular. What about you, Vivek?
So I think one thing which I hope can happen in 3 years, I think there's lots of things to be done, but I'm generally optimistic about stuff, is that, I think that, this NLP is actually getting good enough that, for example, if you have a bunch of documents related to a case matter at hand, and somebody, if they have a question about a particular thing, then instead of actually someone going through the 500 pages of documents that are there, an answer that gets reflected immediately out there, saying that this is really and it may not be related to this case, may be related to some other associated case, and that kind of information becomes available in real time during court proceedings. I mean, that would be, and that would help people to actually, you have so many adjournments, etc., that happen just because something is not there, or somebody can't extract the data that you need at the time that you need it.
Nice one. Girish, something in linguistics which you're super excited by, use case?
I think the translating English judgments into Indian languages would be possible in the next 3 years. And Vivek has already done 9 languages. I think the data in legal space is much more structured and less ambiguity to be expected there. So we can perhaps try translating English judgments into our 22 Indian languages. And that brings in the question of diversity of, the people in India, 90% do not speak English, and the judgments come in English language.
Public record. It's a public record. Absolutely.
Right. And there are, about 672 district courts in India, and most of the proceedings in those courts do not happen in English language, remember. And more than 86% pendency are in these courts, actually. Out of 3 crores pending cases, more than 86% are in the district courts. So we should focus on those areas and languages.
Well said, well said. I hope to see a collaboration where you can add value on this translation piece, Girish.
No, absolutely. And that would be wonderful. And I think that is I think if you ask, translation is obviously something where I'm involved intimately. But our goal is, we must get to a place where this data becomes accessible to all people in all courts. And then you're actually talking something. And I think it is doable. I think it's doable. We'll need help of everybody, but having said that, we're moving forward.
We need to build a consortia, a group of people who can actually work together on this problem. Yeah. That will really progress very well.
Shilpa, a particular use case that you are most kicked about? Shilpa, the connection is a bit patchy, but maybe can you drop it into the chat, please? I really want to get your take on use case because I know that conversation we've been having for some time on a variety of areas. So if you can drop that into the chat, Shilpa. Jameson?
Yeah, hi. So I was going to say contract analytics to be able to understand where terms of a contract, but I've changed my mind after hearing from Vivek and Girish. So I actually think that the most important thing and one of the most beneficial things would be real-time natural language translations of legal judgments, but also legal transcripts for indigent and non-native speakers for court proceedings. So the ability to understand what's going on in a court proceeding, I think would be transformational for people who otherwise would be totally inaccessible.
That's awesome. And I know that my friends in contract automation are hating on me right now. but no,
I've just been sitting with contracts the past couple of days, and so great. But I want to pick up a couple more questions from folks. Please don't mind if I'm moving a little fast. I'm trying to pick up questions where required.
any example of where already we're seeing legal data and NLP transform law and justice in a particular country or a domain? Anyone that strikes you as being inspiring?
Who is that directed to, Sachin?
Whoever wants to take it. Yeah.
And the question is, are there jurisdictions or countries that are doing it?
Countries where it's already ticking.
So I don't know about ticking because I think it's all just beginning. But in London at the ICS Spacey, which is open source in Python, and it's amazing. I mean, they're really making progress. It's really exciting. And I think they're going to lead the way in shining the light for other jurisdictions, particularly because they're within the law reporter, which means it can come from within, not just from without government.
He's in the Codex community as well, right, Jameson? I remember him being on that podcast conversation with a couple of people, and Tucker.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. What about anyone else who wants to point out any particular jurisdiction where they are interested in, they're excited by how it's being used, legal data in NLP? Are there translations, by the way, happening in any other places, Vivek, that you're aware of? Like in the same domain that you're digging in?
No, I'm not aware of translation work being done. I mean, I suppose in India is kind of unique in the fact that we have so many languages that therefore it becomes something which is very important. So I think that,
I see.
So I think that, but maybe I think the European Union, there are some things, because obviously between the different European Union countries, I think that there are certain things because obviously both official and legal documents may need to be in multiple languages, but even there it is not as much. I think India is actually one of the countries which probably needs this translation thing more than others.
Yeah, so just we're at time, and I know there's so I want to just wrap up with a couple of points that I think people would maybe be reassured, those who have more questions. So one is, this conversation is not just sort of an act of let's just have a fun time on Friday evening discussing NLP and data. There's a conscious effort on the part of different entrepreneurs, organizations to really breathe some oxygen into the space and actually increase the access to data, access to tools. And that is the reason why it becomes so important to see how it's been done in different parts of the world, how it's been done for other areas like linguistics, and also to tap into what the real barriers are right now. So one is, this is very much about actually the first steps of designing an initiative to move this forward and make sure that Vivek is not the only one who's doing this, but it's being done as a broad sectoral open initiative. So one is that it's a huge societal opportunity. The law has always been unreachable. And I still remember that amazing slogan of MKSS, Hum janenge, hum jiyenge. That was this milestone slogan of the Right to Information Act. Hum janenge, hum jiyenge. And I think that we must not let go of that slogan. That slogan remains, Hum janenge, hum jiyenge. That must cut right through, I think, for this work. It may be complex in aspects of it. I definitely lost my way when I was studying convolutional neural networks to be prepared for this conversation and not feel like a complete imbecile. But I think that the reality is it has to serve real use cases, and it can. And it's simple in its essence, that it can unlock the value of information. It can make things transparent, which is so powerful. And its impact on areas like ODR, online dispute resolution, new models of legal services, transparency, as Kostav pointed out, accountability is just huge. So folks, be reassured, following this conversation, the key insights are going to be shared by mail. The key resources, there's a list of resources, some of the stuff that I read up and other stuff that Vivek pointed out, Kostav pointed out, Girish's work. We are going to create a compendium, Jameson, all the links that you shared with me in advance and stuff. We're going to create a compendium and share it with everyone. And finally, please do treat this as an invitation to additional conversations that we want to have. I can say confidently, Omidyar and Agami have the conviction and the commitment to make sure that we can host these conversations and hopefully see them mature into an open collaborative initiative. We already have a first version of a justice hub, a repository for an open repository for sharing legal data that will be launched. The alpha version will be launched just in a few weeks from now. And ultimately, we want to look at those hard things that we were talking about. What are the nudges to get training data, repositories of tools to be shared? How do we take it beyond the raw data into other areas? So ultimately, we can accelerate this and make sure that janenge bhi or
Hey, Sachin.
I'm here.
Hi, all yours.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. So, hi, folks. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know that in parts it can be a little dense because there's some technical things, but happy to help to figure that out. We have, in fact, so of course, I was a part of this conversation, and I will be able to relay back a lot of the learnings that were here. But we also have Kaustav, who was a panelist, and Kaustav is an AI/ML expert, and he knows that area deeply. So let's try to answer maybe some of the questions that are coming up. Shayantan has asked a question. Maybe I can take a crack at the first question Shayantan has asked at 11:59, and then Kaustav, maybe you can help out with the second one. First one is the role of AI in complex inferences and interpretations, like inferring on a judgment based on the interpretation of law. Is that even possible given the idiosyncratic nature of cases and judgments? So my take is that at the current moment in time, we are still pretty far from that, because one thing is to understand the meaning of words in the context of a sentence or in relation, like, and to answer very basic questions, a Q&A based on that. And the other is pick up nuances, pick up flows of reasoning. And definitely, like you said, Shayantan, some of it can be a little idiosyncratic. So I do think that we are far from that. We are still pretty far from that. It really depends on the nature of questions that you're seeking to get answered. And as far as I know, the narrowly scoped questions and answers are where we are right now, while more nuanced interpretations, we're still a little bit far away from that. But I think that's where the technology is going to progress rapidly, because even these sort of nuanced reasonings, and when a summary is, when something is a deduction in a sentence, and those kinds of things are getting done at the natural language level. So if that work goes in parallel with the legal work of kind of understanding how what a judgment looks like, what the flow of what a reasoning constitutes, how you apply a point of law, I think you should start to see that maybe in the next 3-4 years, we should start to see those kinds of things coming up. So that's on the first one.
And can I, Sachin, can I add a bit to that?
While you dive in, I think on completing that, as well as on the mechanism by which AI facilitates Shayantan's subsequent questions, maybe you are better equipped to answer.
I don't see the questions. If you could, I'm not sure where to find them.
So
but
there's a queue in the Q&A.
Right.
There's a Q&A board that is there.
Yeah.
At the bottom, right? Can you see that? Can you see Shayantan Chaudhary's?
Yeah.
So essentially, you could help to answer the second and the third one.
Okay, let me just pitch into what you just mentioned. I just want to kind of point out that that the intention is not to replace lawyers. It's about building systems that will assist this, both lawyers and researchers in understanding and access, data and issues and basically the questions that researchers raise. The first intent is to create tools and mechanisms to help them answer their questions around law, etc. So whether there can be any full automation regarding legal reasoning, that's still an academic question. And in places like Stanford, there are courses on computational law, but which is still, right now, it's still in a very small academic corners. So I think we're still far from trying to implement. So I don't see it in the next few years. It'll take a little longer. However, in terms of legal informatics, we've come along. I think we are, set to kind of bring in like novel tools into the industry. So that's what my thought is. In terms of the exact mechanism by which AI facilitates translation, into accessible. So I think Vivek would have been very excited to answer this question. But there's a sequence to sequence neural language models now, where it's basically a neural model where you plug in a sequence of tokens and another sequence comes out. And this encoding and decoding, I mean, all of this is basically there are neural nets which are trained for that. So what kind of data sets? I think, for this, from what Vivek mentioned, like though legal text is not like completely conversational language, and it has a lot of structure in it. So I'm not an expert in the translation world, but from what I understand from Vivek, actually the structure within legal language helps with those kind of translations. So it is actually, though it is a little unnatural in some sense, but it is actually easier to process in terms of like the computational, the computational, like the translation jobs.
So, by the way, I also have another AI ML practitioner with me, Sai Gadam, and Sai is also with someone who's been bouncing off ideas on how far are we from making finding more nuances, looking at paragraphs that compute arguments. And I was just wondering, we could also hear from Sai on his take on how far are we from that kind of more high-end stuff.
So if I think the question is understanding legal documents, and I think I just was to say that there seems to be a lot of structure in these documents. And looking in from the outside, even I think there is, which makes the job easier. So legal documents are in some ways a lot like code, pseudocode. That helps. We already have great language models that work really well with free-form, unstructured, say, Wikipedia corpuses, right? So I think that legal documents, looking in from the outside, models should already do a decent job in annotations, provided with minimal training data, but I don't know what that data size is. And the other thing, what we see is, I think these models are getting really good really fast, right? So there's not a linear progress, there's almost a non-linear. We never know when we hit the next inflection point. So I'd say just even now, the models that exist should work rather well, given annotated legal documents. Maybe you don't need 10 million documents. Maybe you can start with, say, 10,000, 100,000, see what it does, understand where it's failing. Are there specific points that need to be?
Thank you, Sai.
Yeah, on the topic of the amount of data, I think we covered it a bit yesterday. But like my work is on case analysis of Supreme Court judgments on a particular topic, which is land rights. And what we have seen is actually you don't need a lot of data to do something like a classification. You don't need like thousands or tens of thousands. You actually need, you can get started like getting performance from a few hundred documents and get off the ground. So it's, if you have a targeted question, you can actually build classifiers which pick up evidences which are related with certain questions. So a broad general models which understand legal text is I think you're making you're making it more complicated than necessary. Usually if you have targeted questions, annotation is definitely like just annotating a like legal document. That's I think we don't even need machine learning always. We can use more traditional NLP as well as simple pattern matching. Like a lot of it gets you off the ground very quickly. And it isn't only when you have questions like, for example, like one of the questions in land rights is whether a public purpose was contested. I mean, this is one of the questions the researcher asked, and in order to do that, like I needed a few hundred cases to train a linear SVM, like it's a classic machine learning, which is not using neural nets, to get 70% kind of like ballpark 70% accuracy within like the first few hundred cases that I kind of threw at it. So just to give some perspective that we don't need tens of thousands, we can actually start working with small amounts of data and start getting results. And there's a long way to go. And neural architectures are not really like the pre-trained ones like BERT, etc., which was brought up by Vivek yesterday. They're trained on natural language, which is stuff you find on, let's say, Wikipedia. They can get you started very quickly, but actually linear models, the classical models still perform better than them as of now, and we need to work on it.
And in fact, that actually, even before yesterday, I heard that from another conversation on this, where people were pointing out that at current state of the art, there are other models that perform as well or better because they've been trained, they're more actually custom trained, so to say, for those situations. I will, we're coming up on time. I'll take one last question, which is a very practical question that Prashant Shenoy is asking on the money. Is the Indian market ready for the kind of money that's required? I think, one thing I will say is that, yes, there needs to be greater public-oriented spending in this area, whether it's developing the kind of corpora, developing the training tools, encouraging people to share those data sets and training tools. There needs to be greater public spending for sure in that area. So there's no doubt about that. There needs to be also more sharing amongst those who are working on it. Question as to, is this super expensive? I want to just quickly, maybe one last ping at Sai and Costa. This kind of work, Sai, is it super expensive? What's your sense?
Are you talking about the data annotation part?
The part around just being able to exponentially increase the sense making from legal documents through NLP. That part, like whether that is creating the data sets themselves, creating the tools that actually automatically annotate, like that entire, that sort of foundation building work. Currently, there's very little capitalization, very little investment funding going into that, at least in the legal domain. And of course, there's almost no public spending going into that. Are these really expensive propositions?
It depends on what form. It depends on what form the raw data is right now. My guess would be that it is not that expensive. As Kaustubh said, especially if you can start off with documents that have inbuilt structure and you're only looking at say 100 or 1,000. Just get started on that, get a sense of the real difficulty involved. In terms of expense, the main part would be in getting the annotations right? And that's clearly a linear function almost of the number of documents you want. My guess would be that it's not very expensive.
Costa?
So my take on this is, I think it all depends on, the kind of questions you're asking, the kind of accuracy you need. It's fairly cheap to get started today because there are tools around and you can get started. But like if you're producing a report which has like a lot of impact, and you want to be like, you want to achieve like something like 90+% accuracy in kind of translation and actual accuracy of data. The last 10% requires much more intense research, and it is not trivial. So I'm not sure that I don't think it has happened yet. So all of this is conjecture. You need research teams to come together and build up tools for that last 10%, and that may not be as cheap. And finally, I totally agree. We need patient capital in this space, and this is an ecosystem, and patient capital from investors who understand the bigger picture of what we are trying. We're talking about, bringing transparency and, and accessibility to a system of justice in society, right? So, it's not going to happen in like a short, a few years. It might be a decade-long work. where, and it's a cultural change. How people, when people right now, if you talk about like, some litigation and how to go about it, it is such a far off thing. I have to kind of talk to a lawyer and figure out, and then I wouldn't even know what all the parameters. But as an average citizen, why shouldn't I know the law of the land, and why shouldn't I be able to ask quick questions?
Why shouldn't I know what usually happens in this kind of dispute?
Yeah, like, what laws actually are relevant to me right now, where I am, and what are my rights, etc. Why isn't there, like, why am I not close to that? Why does it have, why do I have to talk to lawyers all the time? I mean, so I think the cultural change in this space is what, these technologies can, there is a promise for that. And that requires patient capital, and that is the macro level. That change requires years and a lot of patient capital from investors who align with that vision.
Got it. And I think you also answered a following question on how AI can impact some of the bureaucracy and some of the gaps that are there, just making everything so much more accountable. In the recording, I remember last night, I think Costa, you yourself said one of the things you'd like to see is the feedback loop, accountability and transparency. Like, how does a particular piece of law function? How does the court function? Are they following the precedent? All those things. So I think any last comments before we wrap for the day, Costa, and also Sai, and Sai's daughter Meera, who just popped up just briefly. Yeah. Costa, any last comments for the Charcha audience?
No, I think, we're all, the overarching mission is what we need to keep reminding ourselves, that, it's about, making our society more just and transparent. And all these tools are in service of that. It's not happening in a vacuum. So,
Sai?
Yeah, I'd love to see, evolution of the space, especially if data is made accessible and made accessible very easily, so that, different teams, even individuals sitting in colleges, maybe perhaps who do not have a legal background. So I don't at all. So we could just start looking at that and ask the right people, what do these annotations mean? How do you go about annotating?
Absolutely.
I think getting started would be a great.
I think, to Sai's point, I remember this other data point about ImageNet, which was mentioned in the conversation, which is that almost 40% of the Mechanical Turk workers who worked on ImageNet were from India. So it was amazing to see that. So what could a kind of a collaborative project like that, how could you harness the power of so many law students, so many young people interested in the intersection between law and technology to actually provide a big boost to this space.
And it's not just ImageNet, Sachin, like even today's self-driving cars, all the annotated data, a lot of it happens in India. It's like, we are good at tech services. India is really good at it. So we have like farms of people who are annotating, data, which is driving a lot of the algorithms, in the most innovative of circles in the Silicon Valley. Yeah.
That is so cool.
I've heard people say that AI actually means actually Indian.
No, it doesn't mean artificially Indian. But thank you all so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. This is the beginning of a movement on, open legal data and really moving the envelope on how data can transform law. And just a long conversation, but with all the right actors with the commitment to funding, actors with the commitment to sharing the technology. And so it's not just a college room conversation, even though I love those. But thank you all, and have a wonderful Saturday, Sunday, and last few Charcha conversations, Charcha open dialogues continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.